It's the way that you fill in all the gaps in your knowledge of what happened that day. And the interesting thing about the internet now is that not only can you get news just in a constant feed if you want to, but you can also get it from a specific type of feed, because there's so much volume of information flying around that you can basically pick and choose what kind of world you want to live in a certain sense. You can live in this little bubble where you only read news from, let's say, Fox News if you're one kind of person, and you know, I don't want to say MSNBC, to some extent MSNBC, but I mean, like, you really have to go kind of out there to the very lefty blogs to get the equivalent of Fox News, in my opinion. I'm not going to go too far into politics because that's where I piss off even the atheists. Ask me about it later. But you know, if you're, let's say, of a creationist bent, then you can only read creationist websites and only listen to creationist talk radio, and you can encase yourself in this little comfortable bubble of filters that will guarantee that you only ever hear the kinds of points of view that you ever want to hear. And as if that's not bad enough, we also have websites that lie to you on purpose. So, I love the Onion, okay? I love good fake news. And this is one that came out, I think, well over 10 years ago now, because this was back when Harry Potter was popular, and Christians were really paranoid about what this meant, about people getting into demonic influences. And the beginning of the story, which I don't have up on the slide, but it says, like many of her school friends, 9-year-old Ashley Daniels was captivated enough by the strange occult doings at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry to pursue the left-hand path, determined to become as adept at the black arts as Harry and his pals. And in some sense, that's framed as a news story, although The Onion is one of those sites that's actually good at comedy. So if you're a person who's of reasonable intelligence, you're not supposed to think this is real. But people do anyway. Because this got passed around in a certain community of Christians who emailed each other, and they had quotes like this, a direct quote from some email that is now preserved forever on internet archives. It says, "This is the most evil thing I have laid my eyes on in 10 years. No one seems to understand its threat. Does this get your attention?" So I could make fun of gullible people all day. And I would like to think that atheists never fall for stupid stuff. Hey, Deb. Tried to be inconspicuous, huh? But the thing is, if you've spent any amount of time on social media sites like Facebook, you know that anybody is susceptible to sharing complete bullshit that comports with things they want to believe. And I can't go over them all, but I have a friend named Ed Brayton who does a blog, Dispatches from the Culture Wars, and he has this one tag on his blog that's called Stupid Atheist Memes, where he just collects stuff that's shared on his Facebook wall, like, you know, you never hear about Ted Cruz anymore, but this was a few months ago. News moves quickly now. And there was this meme, like, now people can just put up a picture of a famous person and slap some words on it and then pass it around and say, "Oh my God, can you believe this guy said this crazy thing?" And I realize that text is a little small. In this case, what they're putting in Ted Cruz's mouth is, there would be less disease, less cancer and AIDS and diabetes in this country if people would simply pray. God blesses the righteous with good health and curses the immoral with sickness. So Ted Cruz believes in karma, I guess, which is not too far off from what a lot of evangelical Christians believe, but you can't just say it's plausible that he said this. If you are the kind of person who would wear the skeptic badge as a badge of honor, then you kind of owe it to yourself to look extra hard into the things that seem too good to be true in some sense. So I see this kind of stuff from atheists all the time, and I know I've seen some articles that have been linked recently that show that studies say that like a very, very small percentage of people read anything but the headline before they share anything. At least I think that's true. I only read the headline, so I'm not sure what their evidence is. The internet makes it a lot easier and more efficient to fool people. You can pass lies around very quickly. You know, I used to have a slide at this point where I quoted Mark Twain, who said something like, "A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has finished putting its shoes on." And I thought that was a great quote, but I got fooled because that apparently wasn't Mark Twain who said that. It's actually kind of hard to source that quote, so I don't have that slide up there anymore. The good thing about the internet, though, is that the internet gives the truth a faster start. Because if you're a skeptical person and like to look at things from multiple sources that don't come from a particular point of view, it's easier to check things out. Like we do have sites like The Onion, and even worse, we have a lot more fake news sites that think they're The Onion, but they don't write things that are funny. So they write fake news that actually sounds like things that probably happened, and it's even worse then because you've got something that gives all intentional appearances of being a real news site, sharing something that sounds like a plausible, boring, and not even a little bit funny story. And then people pass that around because it's hard to tell the difference. But on the other hand, you have a lot of great reliable sources like Snopes. I mean, even that might be a little dated. I don't know where is the first place that some of you go to debunk things. But there are a lot of good sites that make it their business to respond to this kind of nonsense as it pops up. There have been, for as long as the internet has been around, you know, I'm talking like mid-90s when it really started to take off as a household word, and even somewhat before that, there have been a lot of anti-creationist locations that you can go to, not necessarily websites. There were news groups, which are like old school versions of message boards, or comment sections, which you should never read, by the way. So young Earth creationists would come up with these outlandish claims, like they would say, the Earth can't possibly be billions of years old. I mean, the universe can't be billions of years old because scientists calculated the rate that space dust falls on the moon, and when we were going to go to the moon in the 60s, the NASA engineers were afraid that there would be so much dust on the moon from the billions of years that the lunar lander would sink into the dust and never be seen again. But it didn't, so the scientists were wrong. Ha, the Earth is 6,000 years old. No, NASA engineers did not believe that. There was one guy who claimed that at some point. He was corrected by a bunch of other people. There was no point at which people were afraid that the moon lander was going to settle into a bunch of dust. But this is the really amazing part, because Talk Origins came out with this detailed debunking, and this circulated so widely that popular creation sites came up with lists of arguments and said, okay, the Earth is still definitely 6,000 years old, you know, but don't use this argument. So sometimes it feels like it's impossible to counter all the false stuff that's going around these days. But there is some amount of difference that you can make by pushing back and promoting critical thinking, basically. It happens slowly, and it happens in small movements, not like big, magical, mind-changing experiences, but it does happen over time. That's not the craziest thing you find on the internet. There are actually places on the internet that are dedicated to promoting the theory that every single president of the United States that has ever been was secretly a member of a race of alien lizard people. Some of these pictures, like I think that one's pretty obviously photoshopped, but the pictures of George Bush and Hillary Clinton are from a while ago, way before she was running for president. If sometimes cameras are not very good and they have little film grain problems or little glitches in the pixels that will make it appear as if one color is extending into a region it shouldn't. And when you are looking for a particular pattern that makes it look like these people have slit eyes, you can find it all over the place for people you're looking for. So there are a lot of people who really believe this, and as I say here, I am not making this up. But luckily the internet also has entire YouTube channels dedicated to debunking alien lizard people. I have better things to do with my time, but I'm glad they're there.
That's my new job.
What?
It's gonna be my new job.
That sounds fine. If I were to get paid for it, I wouldn't have better things to do. And the other thing is the internet encourages skepticism in a way that is kind of toxic to a lot of religions, and that can be a good or a bad thing depending on who's in this room. So I know everybody is thinking it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. It's a good idea to be skeptical of religions in general, even if you're a member of one, because like I said earlier, in the movie Ghost, there is a real world of ghosts out there, but there are still con artists, and there are thousands of religions to pick from, and even if you think that one of them is the actual divinely inspired truth, it's still a good idea to be skeptical of all the other religions. Here are some examples. Let's see, Muslims are young earth creationists, so they have some Muslims. I don't want to overgeneralize. There are a lot of different people on the spectrum of every religion, but there is definitely a strain of young earth creationism in Islam. But the problem for you, if you happen to be a Christian, is that they explicitly say that Jesus was a human prophet who was never crucified and wasn't the Son of God. So you would want to be skeptical of that. Mormons believe that God lives near a star called Kolob, and if you die after living a good Mormon life, you have a chance to ascend and become the god of your own planet.
So Smith is like my great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Oh, what? Really? Oh, that's amazing. Have you seen Book of Mormon, the musical?
It's amazing.
I love it.
My family, but the thing is, my family actually gave up on Mormonism. Like, my family isn't Mormon anymore. We were like that.
Well, I would say Joseph Smith is rolling in his grave, but people don't actually have consciousness anymore, so he doesn't care. Scientology, as the same guys at South Park famously brought up a while ago, believe that all your troubles are caused by galactic overlord Xenu, who invades your body with things called thetans, which are microscopic organisms that invade your thoughts and cause you to experience trauma. The funny thing about this one is that unless you reach a certain level in Scientology, they don't even tell you about that stuff. And so a lot of people who are just new to Scientology hear this and are like, that's ridiculous. They don't believe that at all. But you have to get to like Tom Cruise level before they tell you to do that. Then there's Christianity. But enough about that. The thing about competing religions is they all get debunked wonderfully by Christian apologetics websites. If you ever want to hear a good response to Mormonism and why this golden tablet stuff is nonsense, look for a good site that's run by Ken Ham or one of those other con artists who have a vested interest in not letting you join up with the competition. They do a really good job, I'm not kidding. And that's great, but on the whole, having an easier time accessing information is, I think, doing more harm than good to the cause of keeping people religious. And that, the numbers back me up here. I probably do not have the latest version of this Pew poll, but you'll notice that atheism stays, or not atheism in particular, because a lot of people say, I don't have any religion, but they don't go so far. They're like, atheists are dicks. I don't say I'm an atheist. I just say I'm not a member of any organized religion. But there's a direct correlation between the number of people who don't identify with a religion and the number of people who flat out say they're atheists. And both of those numbers keep going up. And you notice it stays pretty flat until you hit about the mid-90s, which coincidentally is about the time that the internet took off. And it just grew and kept growing. As far as I've heard, the younger generation of people are rejecting religions in record numbers, which is terrifying to apologists like this guy, Josh McDowell, who is a professional finger wagger. And he goes around giving talks on things like the internet has given atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and people who like to destroy everything that you and I believe almost equal access to your kids as your youth pastor and you have, whether you like it or not. And this abundance of information has led to skepticism, and the internet has leveled the playing field. That's awesome. I would like to think that Josh McDowell is specifically my arch nemesis. He has no idea who I am, but I love atheism and the internet. So, but the thing is, in a lot of ways, religion relies on keeping people in that little filter bubble where, a lot of people who grow up in southern towns or other Bible Belt places, often places that are far removed from big cities. I don't know what it's like in San Antonio. I know there are a lot of mega churches here, right? But a lot of ways that they keep their followers is by just telling people that the things they say are true, and then saying, you must not question this, it's true because I said so, don't be a doubting Thomas, it's evil. And the internet kind of breaks that model because people may not have access exclusively to correct information, but they do have access to a lot of different information. And even if they don't want to hear it, everybody uses the internet for everything now, and they can't avoid bumping into people who think you're an idiot. People think I'm an idiot, that's why I don't always read the internet comment section of whatever I'm doing. But I at least take the time to think about and absorb the things that people say about me and consider whether they might be true, which is a good way of undermining your own confirmation bias. Remember that the scientific method, if you're being rigorous about it, there's a lot of other steps to this, but basically you start with a question, not an answer. And then you come up with a possible answer to the question, but then you don't just stop there and say, oh, Ra does carry the sky across the barge, the sun across the sky in his barge, case closed. You come up with a way that could potentially be true or false, provably, and then you make up a specific test that could demonstrate whether or not that's true, and then you stick to the results of how that test turns out. Or you come up with a really solid reason why the test wasn't very good. But I'm saying that people should be in the habit of applying this technique in their everyday lives. And when you run across a meme on Facebook that sounds too good to be true, first go to a site that disagrees with you. A site where people hate everything you stand for, and just look for things they have to say about this thing that sounds so reasonable. Because when you engage with people who don't agree with you, some of the time you're gonna be wrong. And that's uncomfortable, but it's also a growth experience. That's why I don't have the Mark Twain slide on there anymore, because as hard as I tried to prove that it came from where I said it did, it turned out it didn't, so I just stopped using it. And that's the kind of thing you should do in general, which is why you guys at the Secular Student Alliance should go engage with whatever Campus Crusade for Christ. Is that still a thing?
We have so many different.
So many.
At least 20
I
organizations.
get approached on a daily basis.
You get the street preachers yelling at you on corners. People from outside of Texas email us all the time, and they say, "You're so brave for doing an atheist show in Texas." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm not doing an atheist show in Texas. I'm doing it in Austin." Which is a great place. You should visit. San Antonio is great. I used to commute here for about 6 months, which wasn't so great. But you've got a lot of cool things like the River Walk and actual shows on a regular basis, like Book of Mormon probably. I had more cool things about San Antonio in mind, but I mean, it's a neat, thriving city with a lot of art forms and a lot of idiots.
Yeah.
But let's see. I mean, if you've never been to church, which I hadn't for a lot of my life, and that makes me weird. But go to church. I did. If you have specific political proclivities that make you want to read only one kind of website, do read the other kind of website once in a while and get angry. And I'm not saying that you have to take what they're saying seriously, but you ought to at least absorb what they're saying and consider what it would mean for them to be true, and maybe even go ahead and get in arguments with them from time to time, within your comfort level. I mean, nobody needs to be personally abused and name-called and called a whore and whatever. But it's healthy for you to consider other points of view, because that is a foundation of skepticism, and it makes you a better person, and it also makes bad movies a hilarious gold mine of comedy. Just pick out all the things that are wrong with, I just watched a movie which was, it was Christian Mingle, the movie. It was seriously a 2-hour commercial. It was the funniest thing I've seen in months. But that's not the point. I love Secular Student Alliance groups. I think that it's really important to reach out to the people who could be the future leaders in this movement, and eventually, I don't want to say eradicate religion, because that sounds way more violent and more proactive than I really think it needs to be. I just want people to be more skeptical and think about the things that they're being told and come to the best conclusions that you can, even if those conclusions disagree with me, which makes them wrong. And that's about it. I see some people hovering outside the door, but I hope we can do some Q&A if there's time.
I'm pretty sure we have time.
Okay.
No, sorry, that is too Christian to come inside.
I wish you would.
Actually not.
Damn it. What's going on?
All right, let's see. Okay, just making sure nobody was walking. When you're confronted with somebody who disagrees with you, what do you think would be an easily digestible way for you to confront them with your opinion?
I have a general policy, and if you ever watch the Atheist Experience, we have a number of different hosts, and I'm sometimes considered the nice one for some reason. But I kind of have a policy which I've built up over years of talking to random strangers with all the kinds of beliefs that you can think of, that people do not really change their minds all at once. Or sometimes they do, but it's incredibly unlikely that you'll happen to be there at the one specific moment in their lives when their worldview completely turns around, because that doesn't happen very often to very many people. But what does happen is that people start to doubt bits and pieces of what they believe from time to time. And so when somebody radically disagrees with me, the problem is you don't want it to turn into a shouting match. You don't want it to just be going back and forth saying, well, this is true. No, this completely different thing is true, and that's the most false thing I ever heard. Somewhere along the line, you guys agree on something. And there's got to be that point where you can start with the first spot that you disagree and poke at that a little bit. So, like, when somebody starts quoting the Bible at me, I have a whole lot, I don't have a shred of respect for the Bible, but if I was going to say that right away, that would send them off into a tirade, and we'd be talking past each other and not get anything said. So, to me, the more interesting question is, how did you decide that the Bible is correct? Like, I don't want to talk about the details, because I'm just a dumb atheist who doesn't recognize the divine brilliance of the Bible. But I do want to talk about what was it that made you decide that, and how do we distinguish between the Bible saying something amazing and a Nigerian prince saying something amazing. I'd rather have that discussion, because that's a place where we move into non-threatening territory, and we're not just saying your book is full of lies, but we're actually saying, hey, here's an interesting philosophical question. Let's find out how far we can go in agreeing. And you might find out from starting from that point of agreement, wherever it happens to be, that you have some things to talk about, and you get people to walk away thinking, well, that atheist is still full of crap, but I'm going to think about that particular thing he says, because that's a hard problem. Does that help?
What do you think about street epistemology?
About what?
Street epistemology?
We had Anthony Magabusco as a guest like a month or two ago. He seems like a great guy. I don't know, his approach is a little bit different from mine, but the Atheist Experience is a lot more confrontational than he is, because I think his goal is to just have entertaining conversations that entertain himself, which is cool. But we have people tuning in every week. He does too. I'm not gonna talk down to Anthony, because I think he does great work. He doesn't go at people exactly the same way I would, because I would like to come to at least some kind of conclusion before hanging up on somebody. I don't know. What do you think about street epistemology?
I like to use it at least in my private interactions with people.
Yeah.
Because if you get to, you kind of have to find where they're at. You have to find what beliefs they hold, because they hold it. Everybody holds like small like pillars almost of their belief, and a lot of times what they say they believe isn't the real reason. And so you have to get to that reason they believe, that foundation of what they believe,
Right.
and try to kind of knock that out from under them.
Yeah, well, another thing I like to think about, and you know, I'm a gamer and a software engineer, so I'm very goal-oriented myself in a way that doesn't work for some people. But whenever I'm entering a conversation, me personally, I like to think, what do I want to get out of this conversation? If I can change one person's mind a tiny bit, that's a win. If I can entertain a bunch of people, you know, that can be a win of another kind. Aimless talking to people and finding out what they think can be fun, and fun is definitely an end in itself. But yeah, like I think I know what a lot of people will say when I ask them questions, and sometimes I look to confirm things that I already know by actually asking them. But usually I'm in it to at least persuade the other person a little bit, so I don't know. Yeah.
Especially being a host of the Atheist Experience, how have you been so patient with people over this time?
I just said fun is a goal, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't keep having fun. I like getting nice feedback. Sometimes I get really terrible feedback, and that goes with the territory. But you know, I mean, I also like games like Heroes of the Storm or League of Legends, which are competitive games that kind of play out the same way over and over again, but every time you play, you get a little bit better at recognizing what tactics the other people are using, and there's always like a slightly more efficient way to answer a question, or a slightly more pointed way to get people to think about what they're saying. And coming up with those, there's more variety going on in my head than it appears to be when you're like, oh great, another guy is asking the same dumb questions that I heard for the last 3 weeks in a row. Yeah, what's up?
What's the best way to distinguish science from pseudoscience?
There are some rules of thumb, but it's not as simple a question as you might think it is. Because so one of the rules of thumb that I would come up with, for instance, is that you should not assume that a science study that you heard is true because just because you read it somewhere. The first thing you go to when you hear about a scientific claim is, well, what's the mainstream peer-reviewed journal that published an article about this? But that's like just one hurdle to pass, and the problem is that a lot of peddlers of nonsense set up their own sort of shadow organizations and say, oh, well, if they're going to ask me about peer-reviewed journals, I'm going to get a bunch of my friends together and make a journal with a smart-sounding name, and they're all going to review each other. And this really happens a lot. My dad is a physicist, and he encounters